think back to Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. The central character in that movie was the heat. It wasn't Radio Raheem. It wasn't Spike's character. You go back and really watch that movie. The main protagonist is the heat.
Compost and cotton and cornrows. Oh, oh.
Welcome to the Compost, Cotton, and Cornrows podcast, and I'm your host, Dominique Drakeford. And today, we're in conversation with world-renowned meteorologist and climate expert, Dr. J. Marshall Shepard, who is breaking down why climate change is affecting your daily life, from Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing to real-world resilience and what it actually means to co-create with community. Let's get into it. Dr. Marshall Shepard, I am so excited to have you on the pod. Welcome in.
Thank you for having me. It's been I'm glad we were able to catch up. I know it was a
Yeah,
little bit of effort to converge here, but we're here now and it's all good and I'm just so excited to be here.
absolutely. My middle name is persistent from what I've been told. So I'm like, man, you're one of the world's leading climate and atmospheric scientists, and your Rolodex of what you do is beyond incredible, and we'll get into some of those things. But to ground our conversation, I'd love to know how you define sustainability.
So sustainability is a word that means many things to many different people and has
Mhm.
different contexts. From my perspective, as someone who thinks about weather and climate, I think about sustainability in terms of being sort of resilient to changing conditions. In other words, as we see weather and climate change happening, extreme weather changes occurring because of that, we know that we need to do certain things differently uh, in terms of sustainability, in terms of our food supply, our water supply, our energy, and so forth. So to me, sustainability is about conservation, preservation, and resilience.
I love that. Very climate expert, meteorologist centered.
Yeah.
And I mean, and you're pulling this from a very systemic point of view, and I think that's a great way to begin this conversation. Foundationally, I'd love to know, how do you explain what climate change is and really how and why this emergency is so urgent today on just a fundamental level for folks who are unaware?
It can be challenging because people don't necessarily see climate change as this immediate thing. I think they see a flood or a hurricane or a tornado as more immediate. I think they see paying their bills and energy bills and grocery bills and buying diapers and cat litter. Those are things that are more immediate to people. Yet climate change impacts almost all of those things, and so people don't connect those dots that, you know, burning all these fossil fuels that have been sort of buried in the ground for millions of years, but now we're
Mhm.
rapidly releasing them on the scale of days to years, and so it's like a shock to the Earth system, and so we're getting changing climate, we're getting different types of hurricanes and heat waves and floods, we're getting extreme sea level and so forth. And so those are sort of my climate science answers, but I often talk about these things in terms of the so what or the kitchen table issues because
Mm.
it affects the cost of orange juice, for example, or when you have to go buy cereal because that's made from wheat and corn and those types of things that are very much affected by shifts in climate. We're seeing those types of things. Our infrastructure. I mean, I wrote an art. I'm a senior contributor to Forbes magazine, among the many things that hats that I wear. I just wrote an article about the extreme flooding that's happening in the West right now, U.S. West, and how it's putting pressure on the dams and levees and other infrastructure out there, which were designed for last century's rainstorms. It doesn't rain in 2025 the way it did in 1975, and
Mm.
so our roads and infrastructure and buildings are vulnerable to those types of things. So I try to just place this in a so what context. we grow oranges in Georgia now. It just used to be Florida that had a citrus industry, but now we have. So on the one hand, you might say that's good because you've got that warming temperature creeping further north into Georgia. But guess what also creeps further north as things warm? Mosquitoes that carry diseases that we didn't have to deal with here in the United States. So,
Mm,
there are all of these so what issues that I try to frame things from, these sort of kitchen table issues that just aren't obvious to people until you sort of make the connection.
mm. Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, on a day to day, folks are a lot of folks, especially in 2024, 2025, 2026, and even starting in the pandemic, are in survival mode, right?
Yeah.
And so the necessities and the urgency is very in your household. So it
Mhm.
becomes just another almost burdensome layer to think about the environmental impact at large until it slaps you in the face and
Until
there
you
is a
slap them.
hurricane and there is a flood and you can't grow your crops on that
Yes.
farm. And so, oftentimes I'm thinking about what are, from your perspective, one of the most dangerous gaps, right, in the public climate literacy right now? And do you feel like any of those gaps are being exploited to delay individual home action? Because we still have to fight and build while we're surviving. We have to do all the things.
Yeah, no, I look back to the hurricane that just impacted Jamaica, for example, Hurricane Melissa, probably going to go down as the strongest hurricane we've seen in the Atlantic Basin on record.
Mm,
Had a 252-mile-per-hour winds that we measured from one of the instruments we drop out of the aircraft into the storm. It was an event that, even though, many friends and colleagues that I have in Jamaica said, "Oh, yeah, we've experienced, Hurricane Gilbert in night," no. I was like, "No, you haven't experienced anything like what
yeah.
you're about to experience." People have these sort of benchmarks or context storms in their mind, and that's really a because to your point, people struggle with imagining things they haven't experienced, and so they then use reference points that they know that may not prepare them for the current and future hurricanes, heat waves, and floods of the future and of the here and now, because I very much try to talk about climate change in the here and now. I don't like to talk about 2050 or 2080.
Mm,
Things are happening right now. And so
yeah.
why that's important is, we know that there are certain parts of our communities that are particularly vulnerable to extreme weather and climate changes, communities of color, poor communities, elderly, and children under 5. When these things happen, they disproportionately affect everyone,
Yep.
but those groups tend to be most at risk or vulnerable from these things, and so that's why conversations in communities about sustainability and I know sustainability is kind of sort of I know one of the things that you do, and it's certainly very important, but I've actually moved my conversations more into the resiliency space,
Mm.
which is this okay, when you think about Dominic, you think about vulnerability. I'm going to kind of go to class here for a quick second.
Do your thing.
When we think about vulnerability, there are three components that make people vulnerable: how exposed they are to the event, their sensitivity, and then how much ability they have to bounce back from the event. That's called resiliency. So when you look at a hurricane Melissa in Jamaica, or go back and look at a Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, or Hurricane Harvey in Houston, everyone in those communities was exposed to those events, but certainly because of the wealth and economic gap, to answer your question about one of the big challenges, there is this, wealth and socioeconomic gap, and that leads to higher sensitivity to the event, and it leads to less ability to bounce back from the event. So, my family, if there's a hurricane approaching Georgia, and we did have Helene last year, well into the Atlanta area, I can take my family. I have the socioeconomic means to take my family and move out of harm's way. I know that when I come back, if I have good insurance on my home, there are a lot of communities that can't make those assumptions or can't even leave for that, for
Mm.
goodness sakes. And so, when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about resiliency on a local level, we do have to sort of take care of our homes and our local footprints, and that's why you see things like community gardening, urban gardening, community organizations worried about the water quality in their streams and the heat it affecting their communities. That's important. However, the changes that are gonna lead to sort of large scale sort of mitigation and adaptation to climate change aren't going to they're going to require large scale policy changes. We're going to have dramatic reductions in emissions.
Yeah, thank you for that. First and foremost, thank you for your coverage during the hurricanes in the Caribbean. I was following you on
Hmm.
socials and I was like, okay, I trust what he's saying. And the updates were very informative. And I
Thank
know
you.
when I shared it, a lot of folks were like, yo, thank you for sharing these updates because there are a lot of outlets and platforms and opinion pieces during
Yeah,
that time that, are not necessarily trustworthy. So
sure.
appreciative of giving real-time evidence-based, data-informed, uh, um, moments during the time of that hurricane.
No
And
problem.
I actually love this conversation around resiliency because there are some controversial camps around resiliency, and maybe it's not controversial, maybe it's literally resiliency from a cultural point of view and resiliency
Hmm.
from an infrastructural point of view, right?
Right.
So the conversation around resiliency and culture, oftentimes that bumps heads because
Hmm.
a lot of Black and brown folks, communities who are in sacrifice zones are like, I don't want to have to be resilient, right? This is clear environmental racism. We're on the front lines. We're continuously abandoned despite, despite contributing the least to the overall climate crisis. And so embodying resilience, there's some friction towards that because it's like we don't want to have to be resilient. Like we want to just be. And so that becomes a conversation about the models, right?
Yeah.
And then the infrastructural resiliency, absolutely. We need the systems, the ecosystems in place to be able to um, have things when a storm hits, right? We need to be able to have mental health support. We need to not have people come in and steal our property when property is damaged. We need to be able to, have safety at the forefront for communities of color and elders and young kids. So, wanting to know a little bit about your thoughts on the cultural resiliency and the infrastructural resiliency, and if you see friction there.
No, I don't see friction. I see frustration because I mean we know that the global South countries are the least, are the lowest emitters. We know even in the United States, if you look at say the area that I live in, I'm in a suburban part of Atlanta, and then if I go to some of the poor communities around the state of Georgia and in Atlanta, and then even some of our rural communities, they're not the greatest emitters as well, but yet they're going to bear the and are bearing the greatest burden and impact from the large scale emitters, and so there's frustration, but I'm also pragmatic. Okay, we can sit there and say culturally, we shouldn't have to do anything, but we do,
Yeah,
because it is
that's
what it
real.
is, as they say. We're there now. Your property's going to flood, whether you caused it or not. And so, yes, there are two arguments here. Um, those that are at we definitely sort of need ability in terms of who is the greatest emitter, and that's been the sticking point. Candidly, one of the sticking points in global policy on carbon emissions and so forth is many of the if we take it to global scale for a second, many of the countries that are sitting at the table are, wait a minute, we're not the ones that created this mess,
Right,
and
right,
yet
right,
we're the
right.
ones that are getting slapped over the head the most about it. So what are you going to do about it? And so I think there's a feeling, I work with local communities all the time. I think there's a similar feeling here in our local communities as well. So I understand that cultural I call it more frustration,
Mhm.
but we can be frustrated about it and still be resilient.
Yeah,
And
that's real,
uh,
that's real.
so, so I think that's one of the things that, in some of the communities, I'm working with the city of Atlanta right now, on a project. We're looking at some ways to mitigate the urban heat island. We know that parts of cities are warmer than other parts because of the asphalt, industrialization, lack of vegetation and trees. Now we can go back and look at why that is. It goes back to redlining practices from, a century or plus ago.
Mhm.
And so we know the causation there, and that's certainly a conversation to be had sort of there. But, my interest is, okay, y what do we do about that heat island for those communities, right?
Right,
And
right,
so
right.
and
What's the
so
resolve?
that's where we're thinking about, resilient pavements, reflective surfaces, strategies to reduce runoff. So, that's sort of where you get to your point about infrastructure resiliency there. But, that's you related and secondary conversation. But, I think, I wrote a chapter in a book, that Nina, I think it was I forget her name from out of Boston. There's a book she wrote last year or 2 years ago that came out, sort of addressing some of these issues across many spaces within our communities. And I wrote the initial chapter and just talked about the extreme weather climate gap.
Mm,
And that gap is because of the socioeconomic income gap, and we know the sort of historical sort of reasons that gap exists. And so, uh, I think we can have these conversations on multiple fronts, I guess is the real answer to your question.
absolutely. And leaning into resiliency a little more, what do you feel like is the most important touch point right now? Is it at a local level, right? So if we're looking at
Mhm,
microcosms, is it public policy? Is it urban planning?
mhm.
Is
Oh,
it like what do we need to focus our attention on, because you're absolutely right. We know the realities of what's happening and why, especially from a historical lens, and also the maintenance that is continuing to penetrate and target our communities. But what do we need to focus on to create effective and immediate change in our communities at a
yeah.
local level?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is policy driven. Even when I get asked about what do we do about climate change or these types of things, that's, well, yeah, you can. I mean, I drive an EV, or you can change your light bulbs, or eat less, or whatever. Those are important things to do. They
Right,
are.
right, right,
They're low hanging fruit things we all can do. I
right.
compost. There are habits, individual habits that I have that are trying to reduce my carbon emission, a personal carbon emission, and so forth. But I always tell people the most important thing you can do is to be policy oriented in terms of how you're focused, your voting. I don't tell you who to vote for, but just be aware of the fact that local, state, local, national policy changes are what are really needed. So, and it's multi pronged. I mean, we need national and international policy to address the big picture emissions challenges.
Mhm.
But at the local level, you need county commissioners, uh, you need mayors, you need aldermen, whatever they're called in your part of the world, wherever you're listening, to enact local policy. So, for example, we know that some of our communities are vulnerable to heat during the summertime, particularly in urban spaces. There are things local policy can do right now that would reduce heat more so than the Paris Agreement that would
Yeah.
reduce global. I mean, there are strategies about, cool pavement services or strategic greening or cooling state. There are things that local implementation can do immediately that could have an impact in a month.
Mm,
Whereas if you reduce the world's carbon emissions by 30%, you flip that switch off tomorrow, that's not gonna take effect on the climate system for years.
yeah.
And so, that's why I do tell people to really be engaged. The other thing that I think is very important is something we've tried to do, as scholars and stakeholders, we've got to move beyond this idea of going into communities, whether they're urban or rural, and just saying, here's what you need to do. We've got
Yeah.
to co-produce knowledge with those communities
100%.
and remain engaged as opposed
Right.
to popping in every 2 or 3 years on grant cycles. So
Yep. On grant cycles. That's real. That's real. Um Oftentimes when I give like a presentation or something of that nature, I focus on three pillars to look at the system, right? Public policy. So policy is one, marketing is two, and education is three. And
mhm.
so I think that speaks a little bit to what you just said in terms of we also have to be able to meet people where they are and communicate what's happening in a language that feels accessible as well.
Hmm.
And okay, yes. And I think oftentimes like you're a science communicator of sorts, right?
I try to be. I mean,
I
that's
mean
we're
you
not.
are
Well, no,
absolutely.
I am. I mean,
And you're
like
an
I said, I
educator.
yeah, no, I'm an educator. So but my point in that is most scholars that have my background scientifically or
Mhm.
in higher the ivory tower world, we're not trained to do the things that I actually do, like host a
Mm,
podcast or write for Forbes. We're trained to do research and write dissertations and publish
right.
scholarly papers. And so
Right. So you
oftentimes
saying you
there's
go
there's a
above and beyond
we
what your
well,
peers do.
no, I do, and it's just my nature. But what I'm arguing, and one of the things I've recently talked about in some of my writing, is scholars that has to become ingrained in
Mm,
what we
got
do
you. Yeah.
in scholarship and in community engagement. At the University of Georgia, where I am, we do have a very significant public service and outreach component to the university because we're the
Mhm.
land and sea grant university. We have extension agents in all 159 counties in the state of Georgia. We're doing things with communities. It's a part of the DNA of just how we're organized at our university, but that's also part of my DNA, just in terms of my own personal mission.
Mm,
And so, I say that to say if there's anyone out here listening to your podcast that's a scholar or that's
mm,
in the ivory tower, do not see tweeting or engaging with a prison or a community group as extra stuff.
mm.
See it as fundamental to your scholarship and your platform.
Got you. I love that philosophy. Um, I think at this point, especially, I think it has to be inherently, and authentically woven into the DNA of what you are doing.
Mhm.
I mean, it has to. It almost has to be rudimentary. I mean, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that it almost needs to be a prerequisite, but I also find that there are people who need additional training on how
Absolutely.
to speak to and intentionally connect with, um, community that they're serving.
You're spot on with no, you're spot on with that. I mean, there's a little acronym that I actually can't claim it. There was a colleague of mine named Steve McNulty that I heard say this many years ago at a workshop, and it just stuck with me. He used the concept of elf land,
Okay, what is that? Uh-huh.
ELFLAND,
Okay.
elf elf land, and it's an acronym that he uses to sort of engage. He uses it, he said, to engage with communities that are skeptical on climate change, like certain farming communities, ranchers, and
Mm,
so forth. And I've had to sort of use it as well, but it's a way of just connecting with different groups in different ways. So E in the elf land is you establish contact with whomever you're engaging with, right? And then L, you listen to them. You listen. You don't come barging in with your PhD or your credentials. You listen to them. So you've established contact. E, you listen. Then F, you find common ground. And so that's finding a common ground, and finding a value system, right? And then sort of L, that allows you to launch into an assessment, A, and then nurture, and then sort of together solutions or understanding. So, when I go to a farming community
brilliant.
in South Georgia, I was down in peanut country of Georgia. And, some of those farmers have different perspectives than I may have on why climate is changing. But I
Right.
go in and staff say, hey, what are you seeing at your farm? What are you seeing with your peanut yield? Tell me what you're seeing? And then they talk about it and they start saying things that resonate with what I know to be the case from a scientific perspective. But I never put the climate change words out there. It's like, oh, yes, see, I told you. I said, yeah, and so you go from there and then you gain trust and that allows you to then nurture and develop together. So that has always stuck with me. So
Brilliant. I love that. I love that, and how I wish that if there was some way to standardize that
mhm,
across everywhere at this
mhm,
point, but
mhm.
I love that. Uh, I'll make sure to when I use it, I have to write it down, I have to memorize it and internalize it and be able to credit, your colleague.
Yeah, you could yeah, myself, but also I got it from a guy named Steve McNulty, but I
Steve,
it it's
okay.
it's always been consistent with something that I've operated on, though, is just connecting.
But
This is the
connecting
bottom line,
it,
connecting
right.
with people's value systems. You come into a scenario. I'll give you another example. Me and a couple of colleagues from the University of Georgia visited Phillips State Prison here in Metro Atlanta last week. They have asked us to come in and think about ways that we can help cool the prison, like using various strategies, because there's data and studies that show that heat is associated with aggression and also just health issues,
Health, right,
and so,
right.
yeah, just from public physical and mental health. And so, you know the first thing we did is we didn't go in there blazing with what we think they should do. We just went in there and took a tour of the facility to see what it looked like and what we thought. And then we said, well, what do you see? What do you what So one of the things I learned actually in that is that, heat is a big challenge
Mm,
for them. But one of the things they said is that rainfall days are very therapeutic days for the folks in those facilities. And so, you could use that information to develop a strategy around, so you listen and understand the values of whoever you're partnering with, and that always goes both ways. But
yeah, absolutely. I feel like just in hearing you speak, you're very intentional with how you take up space. I'm wondering if there are any emotional, political, or professional costs that come with
oh, of
going
course,
into spaces and telling the truth?
um, there are a lot of different costs that come and go into what I do from multiple perspectives. One, there's I physically sometimes or emotionally get sick when I see events that I know are going to kill people. I
Okay.
have knowledge about certain things that I know are going to be very devastating. I knew a week in advance that people were going to lose their lives in Jamaica because of Hurricane Melissa. And many in my field, particularly in the wearing my meteorologist hat more so than my
Mhm.
climate hat, struggle with that at times. Struggle with the burden of, I think people oftentimes, rightfully so, commend emergency managers and first responders when they go into these devastating scenes, but it takes a mental toll also when you kind of have information about something you really can't stop or do anything about, but the best you can do is warn people. So that's one thing. But then getting to, I actually do have, I guess, a reputation, over the years of being sort of an honest broker, a straight shooter, but
Mhm.
also doing it in a way that's sort of nuanced,
Yep.
saying things to the right people at the right time, knowing your I wrote an article in Forbes 2016 on the 9 tips for communicating science to people who aren't scientists, and the first tip was knowing your audience. So, the way I say something to one particular office audience may be very different than how I would say it to another audience, but it's saying the same things. And
Right.
so that's something that's extremely important that I learned over the years. When I've been called to testify before Congress or advise at White House or not NASA and those types of people, your audience, the trigger points, you get your message across. There, what people and I try to tell my own daughter this sometimes, who's a senior at the University of Georgia, very involved in some of these very same issues. She's getting the sustainability certificate, and she interned this summer with the Partnership for Southern Equity here in Atlanta, just thinking
Yes,
about
congrats to your daughter.
yeah, they were thinking about energy justice and equity issues.
Mm.
And, she's very gung ho and spirited about and very convicted in what she believes in. And I respect that. That's important to her. But I also have tried to kind of, give her advice on, how we have to code switch sometimes.
Yep.
We don't need to code switch when in our beliefs, but you have to sort of switch your approach
Right.
depending on your audience. So,
Right. Yeah, I've had to learn that. I'm a feisty Leo sometimes, but
yeah.
in this space, knowing that especially if I'm passionate about something and something needs to get done, then it's the nature of the beast
Well,
sometimes.
no, and that's the thing that I make important to her. I don't I think if you follow me on my various platforms, I never don't say the things that need to be said.
Yeah.
I think people know very clearly where I stand on things, and I will poke and provoke in areas where it needs to be done so.
But
But
how you say it.
I just use different appro I don't use the same approach each time.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I'm still working on it, but I do understand. I do understand, especially when you carry a certain level of authority,
Mhm.
um, and you have a certain level of experience and expertise, scrutiny is gonna follow you.
You're
So
gonna have to be comfortable with that.
you have to.
As
You
a
have
climate
to.
scientist, period, I get challenged, I get told I'm a hoaxes or a conspiracist.
Oh,
People
yes,
come at
of
me
course.
with various sort of theories and conspiracy theories. If you are going to be an expert or scholar or voice that engages, you're gonna have to deal with some noise, with
Mhm.
attacks, with
Yep.
different perspectives on who you are. And so if you're as long as you're comfortable and you're and that's why I always tell again people, my students, my daughter, whomever, as long as you know your stuff and you know
100%.
it backwards and forward. Like I could walk into a room of where I do this all the time. I'm walking to a room where I know there are a lot of climate skeptics in the room. I know it.
Mm.
And I first of all establish right out of the gate. I say anything that you're about to say, any question that you're about to ask that is counter to climate, I've heard it already. I've heard every single what I call zombie theory that's out there. Zombie theories are these theories that live on like The Walking Dead, even though we've long refuted them as scientists. You still hear them on blogs and certain TV stations and social media posts. As I've heard every one. So unless you can come up with something different,
Yeah.
don't even necessarily bother approaching me with that one because I've probably heard that question. And so you disarm, but you do it in a way. Actually, I don't do it exactly that directly, but you do it in a way that you earn trust and establish that expertise. And then
Yeah.
oftentimes I leave that same room, and they're like, "Wow, I never thought about it that way." Or "Wow, you opened my eyes to certain things."
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it too, it comes with the experience of reading the room, point blank period, and there's always a cost to being an expert in public, and what I appreciate too, and what I'm learning in a lot of interviews is there are a plethora of different personalities in this space who have different voices, who have different experiences and expertise, and we all are just fitting into this puzzle. And so I appreciate an expansive group of folks who are showing up very differently, but also there's, strategy.
Yeah,
I'm
my
here for all
opinion.
of the I'm here for all of the strategy.
There's a young woman here based in Atlanta. Her name's Maya Penn, who
Oh, yes.
you probably know who Maya
Of
is.
course I know Maya. I interviewed her season 1, but we've been friends for many
No,
years.
well, I was about to quote Maya and I were on a panel together a few weeks ago, actually. It was a Hollywood Climate Summit here in Atlanta. And Maya said something that was very important. She said for a lot of times in this sort of climate sustainability space, she felt uncomfortable because she didn't have a PhD in climatology
Mhm.
or sustainability or anything. And she felt like there was a lot of gatekeeping that went along to
100%.
but she basically established, and I really thought that was very important, we need all voices
Exactly.
from different perspectives to engage. My voice is needed in certain places. Your voice, and Maya's voice is needed in certain places. My daughter's voice is needed in certain places. So we need all, as they say, hands on deck.
All hands on
And
deck.
so I think
Absolutely.
that's something that you know, increasingly is becoming evident. And so I'm here for it. So.
I'm here for it too. I'm here for it too. Like, I have folks on the pod who are a little more diplomatic, because of the spaces that they're in and they really get shit done. And then I have
Mhm.
folks who are like, "No, revolutionary,"
Yeah.
and they
Yeah,
get shit done too. And
yeah, you
so I'm here for all the ways in which we're getting things done, as long as you are authentic in your truth telling, right? I think
exactly,
that's
that
the
that's
key.
right. No, I think that's absolutely the key. Again, you know as I often say, and I'll I spent 12 years of my career at NASA before I came to the University of Georgia. I was a scientist at NASA working on these large satellite missions to study planet Earth. And so, people associate NASA with planets and Mars and all that, but
Mhm,
I often
mhm.
remind people the most important planet is the third rock. There's only one planet, Earth. There's no plan B planet. And so,
Right.
you know, we need to understand what we're doing to this one because I won't say what I'm thinking, mess it up. Um, um, we don't have anywhere else to go. And
Mm,
so I think it's just important so for people to marinate on that what I just said there for you. I mean, you mess up your house, or you screw up your house, you burn your house down, you can go get another house, or you can go rent an apartment or stay in a hotel. We don't have a hotel planet anywhere.
that part.
And so, um, that's why I think it's so important. This is not big picture pie in the sky stuff for people that see those of us that talk about climate change and
Mhm.
sustainability. I mean, it really is about the cost of your cornflakes, or whether your child is going to have to deal with dengue fever, or whether that bridge that you're driving across is able to sustain that hurricane or that extreme heat wave,
Yeah.
or whether there's enough water
Even
in
your bills,
or
you
your
put
or
it
your
down to the coins
e
and
e
your heat
e
bill.
exactly. I mean, guess what? We know from the science there are gonna be more heat waves.
Yep,
They're already here. They're
yep,
stronger and they last longer. That means you're cranking up your air conditioning more. That means there are health related vulnerabilities in certain communities that like ours, for example. So these are the kitchen table issues that when people tell me, Dr. Shepard, I'm worried about climate change, but I gotta pay my light bill. Or
yeah.
I gotta pay for my groceries. I was like,
Mm,
I get that, but you know what? That drought out in California, or those wildfires out in California where the Central Valley grows 70 to 90% of the vegetables in that produce aisle of the grocery store you're going to. And guess what? Reduced supply leads to increased prices that you're paying. So it comes right back to that very grocery bill that you're talking about. So, it's just messaging like that, which is very important. And even still, it's not enough. We're still going to have like you said, those policy levers at all of the levels, from local to national to internet.
mm, all the things. Let me ask you, because going back to your meteorologist hat,
Hmm.
um, when we have just honored, I was gonna say celebrated, wrong use of word, but we just honored 20 years Katrina and then just had Melissa.
Exactly.
Is there anything that you've seen that worked was there any initiative or science-based research that was positive?
Sure. I absolutely. From in the 20 years since Katrina today, our weather models have improved dramatically. They were actually pretty good even with Katrina, but we've continued to lower the sort of error that we have in sort of the track forecast. In other words,
Mm,
20 years ago, there would have been a lot more error on where I could tell you Katrina. I would have say, yeah, Katrina's going to hit here, but I'm uncertain by 100 or 200 miles on either side of that. That's probably down significantly, that uncertainty range today and our ability to forecast the intensity. So those are some of the things that we're seeing with Melissa. As I mentioned to you, I knew a week in advance or more where that storm was going to hit and how strong it was likely to be. The AI models, and I know AI has its own ethics issues too, and that's a whole
mhm,
nother
mhm,
podcast. But some of the AI based models were just nailing it. I mean, they're like
mm,
days in advance. So I think on and our satellites have improved in 20 years and so forth. So I think technologically we've had a lot of advancement.
mm,
But where we still lag is in the socioeconomic vulnerability part of the equation. I
mhm,
mean, I think there's still s gaps in who's most sensitive from a socioeconomic standpoint. So, even though we know it's coming, okay, what do you do with people? I'll give you an example. I'll go back to Hurricane Ida in 2021 in New Orleans.
right.
I'm in an episode of the Netflix, series Earthstorm. There's a episode of that on Hurricane Ida. I'm in that episode. One of the things that's happening with climate change, Dominic, is we're seeing what's called rapid intensification. In other words, you might go to bed and that hurricane's a category 1, but you wake up as cat 4 or cat 5. And that's challenging to policymakers. If you look at that episode of Earthstorm, the mayor of New Orleans is in there and she's talking about we need 3 days to do things like evacuate people or reverse the flow on the interstates. Um, but when you've got these storms that are going from cat 1 to cat 4 or 5 in less than a day, you need a new playbook.
Yeah.
Well,
It goes to your resiliency
exactly,
conversation.
because you've got people in New Orleans that they don't have the means to leave. They don't
Yeah.
have the money or so you've gotta have a playbook for those people because you're in an era where you might not have 3 days to evacuate folks.
Mm-mm.
And just, oh, by the way, I know you said you're from the New Jersey originally when we were talking before we came on the
From
air.
California, but I
California,
live
but
in New
then
Jersey.
you
Yeah,
live
yeah,
in New
yeah.
Jersey now. You grew up in California, so you
Yeah.
dealt with earthquakes and wildfires in
Yep.
California, and now you. But I was going to say about your sort of East Coast side, that Hurricane Ida that I just mentioned that affected New Orleans and Louisiana, it then moved across the country and caused significant flooding in metropolitan New York. I don't know if you remember this, but the subways were flooding. People were drowning in basement apartments all throughout New York City. And guess what? These were people that were in sort of lower economic part of the range. So,
Yep. I mean, yeah, Brooklyn in particular has been flooding a lot lately.
so, well, that's the
Just
look.
from regular
Well,
regular
yeah, and
storms.
that's directly related to climate change. I'll tell you why. When the climate warms, just like on a hot summer day in Brooklyn or in, I think back to Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, the central character in that movie was the heat. It wasn't Radio Raheem. It wasn't Spike's character. You go back and really watch that movie. The main protagonist is the heat in many ways. Go back and watch the movie Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee and watch it with what I just said as the lens. You'll see it throughout the movie in very interesting ways. But where I was going with that, on hot summer days or in a warming climate, the atmosphere can hold more water vapor. And as it holds more water vapor, that's more water vapor available to these everyday garden variety rainstorms. So we know from the data that it's raining harder. There's more rain falling out of the sky over shorter periods of time, which leads to these flooding events like you're seeing in Brooklyn or in those subway systems. But it's not just that, it's also the fact that we just have more imperviousness. We have more impervious surfaces, pavement. So when we were all in third grade or fourth grade and we learned about the water cycle, that elementary school lesson actually lied to us because it showed us this water cycle with trees and grass and everything. It didn't show us paved surfaces and irrigation and all the human parts of the water cycle. So now when that heavy rain hits all this paved surface, it doesn't sink into the soil. It runs off fast into rivers, creeks, and streams, and then they fill up and you get more flooding. So, and then the final part of that, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Canton, Georgia, where I grew up, and most other towns and cities, when they were designing their stormwater engineering and removal systems in the 60s, 70s, and so forth, they assumed something called stationarity, which means they assumed that the rainstorms in 1970 were going to be just like the rainstorms in 2025, and they aren't. And so now those engineered systems are being overwhelmed.
Mm. So, essentially what it's boiling down to is, like you said, I think every city, municipality, neighborhood needs a playbook in order to be resilient and to be fully prepared. Be ready so you don't have to get ready type of playbook, right? And
Yeah, yeah,
then
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm a big, but people are surprised to hear this, but one of my favorite hip hop artists is DJ Quick from the West Coast, and one of his guys in his group was Sugar Free, and he had a song called if you don't have to get ready if you stay ready. So
that part,
yeah,
no, that's real. And we gonna get to music at the very end. So I'm
yeah, I'm a
glad you
big
lifted
music
that up.
mark. Yeah,
Um, and then I think that coupled with there needs to be dedicated funding to for complete structural design changes,
mhm.
correct?
You're gonna have to design your homes, your towns, your roads, your hospitals, your community centers for this generation of weather and climate
Mm,
and what we call compound disasters. I co-authored an article, not an article, a report actually for the National Academies of recently. It's out. It came out last year, looking at compound disasters that affected the U.S. Gulf Coast from the years 20 and 2021. Compound disasters are these disasters that have multiple facets to it. So you might have a hurricane, but then the hurricane knocks out the power in the water system. And oh, by the way, in 2020 and 2021, we're still dealing with COVID. So what do you do when you've got Hurricane Ida approaching? You want to evacuate further inland into shelters, but those shelters are infested with COVID. So that's a compound disaster. And so we're going to face more of these compounding and cascading disasters along the way. we talked about in that report, we've got to do this. I'm an alpha. I pledged Alpha Phi Alpha at Florida State University.
I see that.
And I can see that. And one of the things that the big brothers used to tell me back in the days when we were pledging, we had something called the 6 P's. And they were basically prior planning prevents poor performance. Is that well, that's 5 P's because I left one of the P's out that they used. But that's what we need when we think
It's
about when we
for
talk
yeah.
about resiliency, right? Because we often have a tendency to respond after after the Katrina or after the
Right.
flood or after the heat wave when we know these things are coming, and so we can, save lives and money
Yeah.
when we're proactive.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Part of our deficit is that we are reactionary.
Yes.
Um, and I was speaking to a climate tech specialist not too long ago, and she was saying the same thing. Like we have to be in front of everything and figure out your lane, right? You can't do all the things all the time, but
Right.
figure out your lane and become an expert in that lane, not because you need to have the accolades, but because your life depends on it.
You're like well, that one of the fundamental things that I wrote an op-ed piece with a couple of colleagues in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution after
You
Hurricane.
just all the we didn't I didn't go down the list of all your accolades, but I love that you're weaving them into this
Well,
conversation
no,
because
these are just
I
things that
need to
I've
hear it.
done. No, that's just things
It's
I've done. I
okay.
wrote
I
an
love it. I
op
love it.
No, well, so I wrote this op-ed in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution after Hurricane Helene, saying we are in a scenario here in Georgia, and particularly in the Atlanta area, where it's no longer our coastal cities that have to prepare for hurricanes. We are in
Mhm.
an era where strong hurricanes like Hurricane Michael and Idalia and Helene will impact Atlanta, you know, 4 hours from the coast. And so that's not an anomaly. Those are we're gonna have another Helene. We're gonna have another Melissa. We're gonna have another heat wave that like we saw in the Pacific Northwest in early parts of this century. They're gonna happen again and likely with more intensity and frequency. Are we gonna just
Mm,
sit and wait or
mm-mm.
are we going to respond proactively? That's what I
Right.
mean. But one of the greatest ways we can do that, and it has nothing to do with climate science or weather prediction models or radars or satellites, one of the biggest ways that we can increase resiliency right now is by narrowing or closing that economic gap among races and communities and so forth. Because at the end of the day, resiliency comes down to the economic gap.
Mm. I think that was the final gem. Dr. Marshall Shepard, I think that was the final gem.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's really,
Thank
I,
you.
yeah, and you mentioned this, but I'm out there on various platforms at Dr. Shepherd Knows on TikTok, at Marsh for FSU on Instagram, and I'm also on LinkedIn. Yeah, for your listeners and viewers, I mean, feel free to follow. I'm actually a scholar and an academic that engages actively on those platforms.
Yes. Thank you so much. And before we close out, like I mentioned, we're gonna get back to some music, right?
Okay,
So this season, what I'm doing is I am having a sustainability soundtrack.
okay,
I'm gonna ask you a couple of rapid fire questions that's going to contribute to
okay,
an upcoming mixtape. All right.
100% down.
You ready? All right. What song is bringing you joy right now?
What song is bringing me joy right now? It's actually a new song on the new De La Soul album. De La just dropped a new I'm a big De La Soul fan, and they dropped the song, and the album just came out. I don't literally know the name of the song, but it's actually kind of a gospel 10 song and
Okay.
then I'm not a huge gospel music fan,
Right.
but that song is constantly it's just on repeat right now on my Spotify.
Okay, I gotta figure out what
Yeah,
what that song is.
I'm gonna keep firing. I'll tell you the name of it because I've got
Okay,
it on
okay,
repeat play. I'm pulling up Spotify right now,
okay.
and I'll tell you the name of it because it's just yeah, it's an amazing song. And part of the reason, they lost one of their, and so I think the song is really sort of related to sort of him. Wait a minute, just how it is sometimes.
Mm,
Yes.
okay. I'm
Nope,
excited
sorry.
to listen.
Nope, sorry. Believe. De La Soul, Stout, K. Butler, and yep, that's it. Believe. It's on the new Cabin in the Sky album by De La Soul.
Perfect. Believe. All right. Okay. Second is, what song helps you heal when life is feeling tough or frustrating or stressful?
What song? you know, that's an interesting one. I'm gonna have to go with "Fly Away" by Goody Mob because the attitude of that song is, and especially CeeLo's verse in it. He's basically talking about, and let me stop this from playing. He's basically talking about, the part of the song is, if you don't like what I say, fly away, fly away. So it's just this song about just being comfortable with who you are, your marinated, your culture. And so
Love
that
it.
when I don't need a lot of reaffirmation of who I am, but that song
That's
always
right.
just puts me in the right frame of mind. So,
Love it. Love it. Love it. Okay. Last one. And this one typically stubs people. Okay.
mhm.
What song sounds like sustainability?
But what song sounds like sustainability?
Whatever that is to you.
Mhm. No, I get where you're coming from with that.
Mhm.
This might surprise you, but
Mhm.
one of my favorite groups, musical groups, is a British new wave group called Depeche Mode.
Okay.
And Depeche Mode actually has a lot of songs um, that actually are sort of sustainability tinged. Um, but there's a song. It's called "The Sun and Moon and the Rainfall." It's kind of the obvious answer to this
Right.
question by Depeche Mode, but, there's also a song by them called "People Are Good," and it's really, if you know the songwriter of Depeche Mode, he never writes things that are obvious.
Mhm.
So, that song to me is about sustainability because it's basically saying, "Don't assume people are gonna do the right thing."
Mm.
So, saying people are good, it's he's actually really saying people aren't good. So you've gotta be proactive and sort of take matters into your own hands, and so that's to me about sustainability. Sustainability is you're empowering yourself, you don't need some government to do sustainable. You can be sustainable and have sustainability at all levels, and so "People Are Good" by Depeche Mode sort of rings to me subtly about sustainability.
Love that.
Yeah.
Love it. Love how eclectic your mixtape is. I love it. I love it. I love it so much. But thank you so, so, so much. I mean, you are literally one of the most visible and intentional climate scientists in the mainstream space. You've reached literally the highest levels of academic and scientific recognition. And so I'm just honored to have shared some space with you and absorb your knowledge. This was
Happy to
great.
happy to do it. I think this is always a good time for us all to reflect on, how we can sort of start the new year on many of these in many of these thoughts and concepts and spaces.
Absolutely. Thank you again. And you've already told us how people can stay connected with you on socials, on the
Mhm.
web interwebs, and that's it. That is a
Absolutely.
wrap.
See ya.
If this episode taught you something new, be sure to share it with somebody in your community. See you next time.
Composting cotton and cornrows.
We've turned nothing to gold since the birth of our soul. It's ingrained in our room. Black is more than flesh and bone, planted deep in our code, and we bear the fruit. Yeah, they wonder how our stride's so bold, and our pride stone cold after all we've been through. Rich as the texture of our crown. We pass it on to the youth.